Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at authorization and the three main building blocks: authorization requirements, authorization policies, and authorization handlers. In this episode, we're going to take a look at some other concepts that can be useful to know that you have them in your arsenal, but you might not end up using them. And I'll try to timestamp the videos, so check the description. I'll try to pin a comment as well, and I'll try to go in the order of their importance. So the first one is you're probably going to end up using it, and quite a bit, and it is the IAuthorizationService, and it can be used to strategically place your authorization requests. So what I mean by strategically placed is at the moment you authorize the function, the whole function itself, but let's say that you want to authorize somewhere in the middle of the function, right? So how would you do it? So going to the top here, what we can do is we can inject an IAuthorizationService, and we'll call it with the same name. We're going to make a global field, if it allows me. Yep, make it read only. So now when we have the authorization service, what we can do is, let me just drop down to the bottom here, and I'll create a public IActionResult. This will need to be a sync task do stuff. Oh, and let's just return view. I'll just return index, and let me import using task. Okay, so let's say we're doing stuff we want to allow somebody to go to this action, but then depending on what happens in this function, so let's say we are doing stuff here, we want to go ahead and start authorizing, right? So we want to let you do something, but then we want to make sure that you can only go here if you are authorized. So then we can take the authorization service and we can call authorize async. Okay, and the thing that we are going to pass is http context.user, and the next thing is we're going to pass the policy. So in terms of the policy, this will have to be one of these policies that you will register, and let's await on this. So essentially, authorization service, you call authorize async, you pass in your user context, so you don't necessarily have to call http context, and then in the end you specify your policy. Now do take note that we pass in a claims principal, and then we can pass an authorization policy. And remember that we can create a builder, new authorization policy builder. We provide some schema, right? And we can now grab this builder and create a custom policy, right? And this policy can reside in the function if this is the only place that it's being used at. So builder, whatever we can, require claim, standard stuff, you know. Let's say hello. Alright, so you need the claim hello. And then let's build it. And let's say custom policy. Okay, so at this point, when you call this function, you are going to get a result. So let's go ahead and say auth result, and let's store it. Boom. And now we can say auth result succeeded. Do something if succeeded, otherwise we're going to go ahead and return. Not only does this allow you to strategically place authorization in your controller, it also allows you to strategically place your authorization in the views. So one thing is, if you know how to do dependency injection in views, it's very similar to controllers, but you have to know just one syntax trick. Actually, let's keep this at the top. And what we have to do is type in inject, and we can just grab the type that we're injecting, IAuthorizationService, and we can call it the same name. Okay, AuthorizationService. You will need the namespace for it, so you can press F12. on the IAuthorizationService, service, get the namespace, go to the view again and type in using and give it the namespace, and then it will find the class. And now you have essentially the same access as you would here to this authorization service, and you can call all the same authorized mechanisms. If authorization service authorize async, and we can wait. Again, in HTTP context, we have access to our user context, and we can we can pass in our own custom policy again. So let's go ahead and grab this claim date of birth policy, put it here. Now we will wrap this bit and call succeed on it, right? So if this succeeds, go ahead and display something like user has date of birth claim. This part is about the iAuthorizationService service and the fact that it allows you to strategically place authorization wherever in your application. So be it a view, be it a component, or be it a function. And if you don't want to, if you're using this authorization service only in one function, and not you might not want to inject it like this. So let me cut it and let me show you how you might want to inject it straight into the method. So you can call from services. And what is this error? Okay, and then I think I cut it. Yep, I'm just gonna grab this type because I don't want to type it out. And you can inject the authorization service here, like that, and it will be local to here. We can of course run this, and I will just turn view here as well. And we can just put a breakpoint here when I run it. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Okay, so let's go to home secret. And there we can see that we get the grandma's cookie and user has the date of birth claim. All right, now if we go to home do stuff, we're gonna hit here. Now we have created our new custom policy that requires a claim, and this should be false, and it is because our user doesn't have claim. And the way we can check our user without going to HTTP without having HTTP context here is through the locals window. If you don't have it, you can search at the top here locals, and this will give you your local variables, and you can click on this, and then you basically have access to your user context and your HTTP context, and you can drill down further and inspect what values it has. Okay, so I think this will be it for iAuthorizationService service. Do note, because you do have access to your HTTP context, HTTP context, or its context here. Yeah, so it's context in your Razor view, but you have access to your user context. And what I'm trying to basically say here is you can check your claims, and you can, if you go to identity, and you can check if the user is authenticated. Basically, let's bring a real simple example. Let's go for user, let's go for identity, and let's check if is authenticated. And we're just gonna say user is authenticated, and user is not authenticated, right? Simple access, quick checks. This is when you want to call upon your user. You don't want to start registering complex logic and functions in your views. What you want to do, if you want to check something with the user, if you just need to check a claim, or if the user is authenticated, or if you're using the same mechanism to check the same claims, you might want to think about putting it in the policy, because then if you wanted to change that mechanism, you only have to change it in one place, right? And this is more of the, your big guns, reusable functions, right? So there will come a time where we will identify essentially a group of users that will be authenticated in a way, and you want to abstract that into a policy, okay? And that's how you will use your big guns. So you can see that we're importing a namespace and we're importing a service just to check a claim. So if you want to check a claim, I think checking it through your user is fine. This is more of the big guns, you know? Okay, so the next functionality that I want to go over is a global filter. It's a really simple concept. So MVC allows you to have filters. It's sort of like it's part of the middleware. And if we go back to the home controller, the authorize attribute is not a filter really, but something similar to a filter. Is the fact that we have this middleware here, and then inside MVC there is kind of its own middleware that you can sort of build around the action execution. But we're not going to dive in too deep into that. Let's just go ahead and grab the configuration for MVC. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into the config, we're going to go into filters, and this is where you add your filters. Okay, and what we can do is we can add, and here we can add a new authorize filter. Okay, and the constructor of this filter can also accept an authorization policy, and this will essentially be a global filter around every single action. So this can be quite useful if you just want to add global authorization of some default type. So let's go ahead and just copy the default here that we have set up before. We just need this default policy. I'll uncomment it, and I'll discard this claim, and we can just provide this default policy, and this will give us a global authorization filter. Okay, why would you want it? I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but if you want just a super secure site where you need a user to be logged in, this is the thing to go for. And then let's say we are going to get a big error here because everything is going to be authorized. So even our login page, so you see we basically get an infinite redirect loop. And the way you lift authorization requirement is through a AllowAnonymous attribute. So what happens under the hood in the authorization middleware is if it scans the action that you're about to execute for an AllowAnonymous attribute, and if it has it, it will just exit. It will not do any authorization. Okay, so AllowAnonymous is your get out of jail free card, basically. So there we go. We have authenticated. User is authenticated. User has a date of birth claim. So this will be it for the global authorization filters. I'm gonna go ahead and comment this out. Let's go ahead and close this. Next thing that I want to take a look at is the operation authorization requirement. All right, and this is just a base object that it provides. Right, so we'll just take a look at it real quick. So let's go ahead and just create an operations controller.cs, and this will be a controller. Okay, and to give you an idea of what an operation authorization requirement is, you know how we have created a requirement here? An operation authorization requirement is an object implemented by Microsoft, and it's meant to work from a constant list of operations, a well-known list of operations that you implement that will allow you to sort of pass through this operation authorization requirement, make your code a little bit more readable. So let's go. But once you know this concept, it's a little bit easier to use. So let's create a public class cookie jar authorization handler, and this is going to be an IAuthorizationHandler, or rather no I, because we want to specify a type. And the type that we're going to give is something that Microsoft has already given us, and it's going to be an operation authorization requirement. Okay, and there we go. So if can this implement it for me? No. Okay. And implement abstract class. Okay, so cookie jar authorization handler, and what I'm trying to do in this class is authorize a cookie jar, right? So I have a cookie jar, I have in there, I have my favorite cookies, and I want to authorize people. Like, no, not anyone can just go in there and take my cookies, all right? Authorization handler, again, this is something that I'm gonna have to go register in my startup, and when the inbuilt authorization policy will be basically creating a operation authorization requirement request, right? I'm going to be hitting a policy, or I can reuse this handler. So I have this cookie jar authorization handler, right? I want to basically control who is going into my cookie jar, right? So let me show you how to use this. All right, let's first actually implement this, right? Okay, and first let me format this a little bit. Okay, so first thing is, let's take a look at the authorization requirement, right? So all it has is a name, okay, and it implements the IAuthorizationRequirement, requirement, same thing that we have implemented in our custom requirement claim from IAuthorizationRequirement. It's just the same requirement, but what's called Microsoft provides us this class, but it's meant to denote a concept of you are trying to perform an operation, and all we're doing is just going to give it a name for this operation, right? So let's go ahead and public class, and this is going to be a static class because we want to provide a cookie jar operations. So the stuff that you can do with a cookie jar, right? So if it's my cookie jar, right, I'm gonna say a string, and let's say open, right? And all I'm gonna do is assign a static open operation, okay? And now it's hard coded. Next thing, let's say take cookie, and I'm just gonna say the same thing here. So this is just static strings, and if we're using this static string anywhere else, it will be it will be easy to change this key, sort of thing. Let's make a few more, and I will say take cookie, come near. So if it's my cookie jar, I'm gonna make sure that you can't even come near if you're not allowed near my cookie jar, right? Or it's like look, like, right? Don't even look at my cookie jar. Okay, and now in my operations controller, I might have something like public async task and action result open, and somebody would want to open my cookie jar, right? Let's just return view that doesn't exist, so we don't get the error. And let's actually grab our IAuthorizationService, and we can grab the authorization service and make it global. I'm going to generate this field. And in here, we're going to basically return task complete task, just so we get rid of the pesky error. So we have this task, and we're going to send an operation here, right? So I want to check if somebody is trying to look at my cookie jar, right? So I'm going to say requirement name equals cookie jar operations, and we're going to say, right, somebody's trying to look at my cookie jar, right? So if you're trying to look at my cookie jar, I want to basically say, right, let's grab the context and let's grab the user, and let's just make sure that the user's identity is authenticated, and let's say, yeah, is authenticated, and if it's authenticated, context succeeded requirement, right? So then you are okay, you're allowed to look at my cookie jar, right? So else if requirement name equals cookie jar operations, and let's say you want to come near my cookie jar, right? You know, if you're authenticated, you were sort of led into my humble abode, into my house, and you know, you've been authorized to come in. You can, you've been authenticated. You can look around, right? But now, I'm trying to come near my cookie jar, all right? And you know, if you want to come near my cookie jar, I don't know, you gotta be a friend, otherwise, you know, might bite your arm off. So, friend, all right. So you need to claim friend, or yeah, friend, and good friend. You need to be a good friend, and then you can basically have this requirement, right? So this is just something to sort of centralize your requirements. I hope you guys are getting this. And then you can basically grab your authorization service, you can authenticate async, and then you can essentially go ahead and pass in this operation requirement. All right, so var requirement equals operation requirement. So let's go ahead and craft a new operation requirement, and we can go ahead and set the name to operation or a cookie jar operations. And let's say somebody is trying to come near my cookie jar, and what we're going to do is we're going to authorize the user, and we're going to give it a requirement. And let's take a look at this. So it's asking for us. Okay, so that's going to be the next topic of our talk. Let's just pass a null here, and let's go ahead and wait on this. So here we're essentially, oh, actually, sorry, we're trying to open our cookie jar here, right? So the action is open. We're trying to open the cookie jar, and we're essentially going to authorize this. So this null right here is essentially a resource that we might want to pass in order to abstract this a little, this concept a little bit further, right? But the main thing that you want to understand here is that if you are going to be authorizing by some operations that users are going to try to perform, you may want to opt in for creating a handler that is essentially going to be using this operation authorization requirement that's already built in, and sort of following this pattern. Now the good thing is about this is that this resource variable here that we can pass. So let's say that we have a public class cookie, right? So I have multiple cookie jars, right? Let's call it a cookie jar. Public public string name. I'll give it a name of whatever. You know, this doesn't matter at this point. The point is that I have a cookie jar, which is a resource. Now, to give you a more real world example, there are programs such as KeePass and LastPass, which are essentially password repositories, right? So let's say, depending on your role in the company, so you might be in infrastructure, so you're going to have passwords that are going to be used only by infrastructure, and you don't want to be using passwords that are going to be used by the service desk, okay? And you guys are going to have different passwords, but you're going to have this centralized storage, and the application is going to be controlling who is allowed to see which passwords, right? So the resource in this context is the password, but in our context, it's the cookie jar. Because let's be honest, the cookie jar is more important, right? So we have the resource, and we want to authorize, and we want to authorize the resource, and on the password we can only perform so many operations, and usually these operations are going to be CRUD operations, so create, read, update, delete operations, right? Or we might want to generate a password. I don't know, if you're a complete stranger to the company, we might not want you to even look at the passwords, right? But then why would you authorize them first? So, but these are questions that you will have to answer, right? So the main point I wanted to take away from this operations authorization requirement thing is that you can also authorize by a resource. So let's go ahead and create this cookie jar. We have the cookie jar operations, so we have these operations, and now what we can do is we can also pass the cookie jar as well, and we will need to supply another parameter. So cookie jar, and now we can throw the resource that this authorization is trying to access. So what might happen is we might have a cookie jar, right? And we're gonna grab our get cookie jar from database, right? But I'm obviously not going to implement a database for this example. All I'm saying is basically before you can authorize something, you might need to get it from the database, right? So you might want to put it here. So you get your resource, you tell it what operation the user is trying to perform on this resource, and then you pass it to a function which, based on the user that's trying to access a resource in some way, and that's basically going to execute the function that you're going to do. And then you have your predefined list of operations that you want to act on this resource. You give them the according names, and basically being aware of this concept. When you come to work for a company and you see this again, I have a few doubts that you might see this, but I have some doubts that you might actually see this because people tend to not to mix in with the framework too much. But nonetheless, if you need something like this, know that this is already built in here, right? So if you have users and you have resources and they're going to be performing operations on the resources, this sort of this is already scaffolded out for you. And what you can also do is you can create a public static class cookie jar operations, and let's actually call them auth operations, right? And what you will do in this class is you will create public static, not strings, but you will rather create these operation requirements, and you will create an open one, and you will create a new operation requirement, or rather, because it's static, you can give it one of these guys, and name equals cookie jar operations open, right? So now you also have easy access to these to creating these functions. So you can go ahead and let's say you don't even need to store this requirement here. You just go ahead, pop this class and open, right? So cookie jar auth operations. So we're trying to authenticate an open operation. So you're trying to open my cookie jar and you're this user, and we have our authorization handler. Now don't forget to remember that this will need to be added to the middleware. So if I copy the name, I go into startup and I'll just, where do I, authorization handler. So there it is. Just gonna pop this here, and this is where we're gonna add it, right? So this is just another mechanism, and just know this is not something that you need to know, but this is something that can be useful if you know that this exists in .NET Core and is available to you. You know, you might be working on a project and it will just pop into your head one day, this is available, I can just use this, and then you will be a happy man or girl or whatever else you identify as. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about another concept, and this concept is going to be a IClaimsTransformation interface. And let's go ahead and actually, where is it? Let's just create a transformer folder, and in here I will create an. So first, basically, I'm just gonna set it up real quick, and then we're gonna go over what this does, right? So let's go ahead and create a claims transformer, or rather transformation.cs, and I'm just gonna say inherit from IClaimsTransformation. Okay, and we're gonna implement this. Right, so this is a very simple class, and what happens is after you register with your dependency injection container, anytime your user is checked for authentication, this function procs. Okay, so this is going to be called multiple times. Every time your user is authenticated, it's going to proc. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this does. So we're going to go ahead, take the principal, we're going to grab the identity, and what we're going to do to this identity is we're going to, because right now it's an I identity, so we can convert it to a claims identity. Okay, and okay, sorry, cast it here, and I'll still need a bracket here. Okay, so claims identity inherits from my identity, so I can convert it that way, and all this does is allows me to call the same functions that I did when I worked on my home controller here when I created this claims principal, right? So what I want to do is essentially, let's say principal claims, and I'll just say any, right? And if type equals friend, right? And let's say var has friend claim. If doesn't has friend claim, let's go ahead and add the claim here, right? So we're going to just say new claim, and we're going to say friend, and let's say good friend. Or rather, if we haven't assigned it, bad friend, right? So like that. So, and now we're just going to go ahead and return the principal here after mutating it. And because this is a task, we're going to have to call task from result here. Now again, I just want to repeat that this is not a particularly good example. I can't remember the last time I used this. I think I used it once to do something with Active Directory and to populate the claims that way, but I don't think that was a good solution anyway. But just let's go ahead and just go over this and see what this works and how this works. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. I'm going to go on to the startup, and I'm just going to go ahead and say that I want to register this IClaimsTransformation. So let's go ahead and put the interface here, and ClaimsTransformation class, let's put it here. And let's import these two types. Okay, like that. Okay, so now that we have imported it, I'm going to go ahead, launch my application, and I'm going to just show you how this occurs. Okay, so if we're on the main page, we're not authenticated, and we refresh, so the user context is empty. The IClaimsTransformation isn't triggered. Now, if we go to home/secret, the IClaimsTransformation is triggered. And if we pay attention to the claims, they are not going to contain the friends claim because we're not going to assign it anywhere. We then go ahead and add the friends claim, and now if we take a look at the principal, the claims list has the friend claim with the value bad. If I press F11 here, I should see the destination of where I arrive, and that's the index page. Okay, so what has happened is I went through the authentication method and my claims identity got populated, but this is where in the authentication middleware the claims principal got extracted from the session, and when it gets extracted from the session, it got dragged through this IClaimsTransformation. Okay, so the effects of this will be a little bit more apparent when I refresh the page again, and it goes through this method again. But now the what's it called? The friend claim is gone again, and it's just gonna add it again. So it doesn't override the state. So we're essentially every time we hit a every time we hit a action where the user context is being populated, it's gonna extract it from the session and it's gonna drag it through the IClaimsTransformation. So if you cannot add claims that are basically rooted, the population of which is rooted in the mechanism deep inside, this is a good way to sort of like, right, say, let's just apply a wrapper around the way it extracts the claims principal and just constantly populate it with whatever we need to populate it. And do note that you have access to dependency injection here, and you can do everything else that you can do with dependency injection. And this is asynchronous, so you can make API calls and you can do asynchronous calls to the database. Now let's go ahead and close this all. Okay, and the last one but not least is the authorization policy provider. Now, you can build your own custom authorization policy provider, and that's something that is essentially that's going to take these options, and that's what's going to be resolving your authorization policy. Think of it as a container or a resolver for your authorization policy, right? So it's an authorization policy provider, and that you can only have a single instance of that here. And the reason you might want that is, imagine if you have like a gazillion roles, and let's say you don't want to do something like this if the mechanism is for resolving the role is practically identical. So I'm going to show you how you can go about implementing your own policy resolver. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a folder, and let's create a custom policy, sorry, not resolver, provider folder. And in here, let's just create a folder for now. In here, what I want to do is create a custom authorization policy provider. Okay, so this is going to be a provider of authorization policies, right? So authorization policy provider.cs, and let's name it custom. Okay, now what we could do is we could implement an interface, which is literally an IAuthorizationPolicyProvider, and that will require us to implement this interface. But remember that when we register our authorization provider in dependency injection, that is already has a default provider. So let's say I want to use some of the default functionality provided to me instead of overriding all of them, and that's what we're going to focus on. And you will get an idea of sort of what it's doing instead of implementing all of these. So instead of grabbing the authorization policy provider, we're going to grab the default authorization policy provider. And again, this is coming from the same namespace of here. And if we press F12, we can see that it implements the same interface, but the implementation is hidden away. And if you look in the source code, you will see what it's doing. Okay, but essentially the reason I am grabbing this method is I don't want to implement these two things because these are sort of the fundamentals, the default. I don't want to change those. I'm okay with those being there as they are. What I want to do is the main get policy async function, which is virtual and which we can override. Okay, and these are not virtual and we cannot touch these. Essentially, we can use this virtual function and override it. So this is what's going to be called when it wants to resolve a policy. So in our startup, where we add a policy, when the middleware goes off and works, it will essentially try to call this get policy async function to grab an authorization policy to see its requirements based on the name, and then based on the requirements, it will go off to the handler and see if we meet the requirements. Okay, so let's see what it's crying about. It wants us to generate a constructor so we can pass the options to the base class, and the options are these highlighting the wrong stuff, are these options that we're passing to the add authorization middleware. And if you go here, you can see it's this authorization options. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these two get default policy async and get fallback policy async. What I'm going to do is I'm going to override get policy async. So now if somebody creates an instance of this class and calls get policy async, it's going to call this one, but we can still essentially, let me create a public class dummy, just so in the constructor I can create this class and give you an example. So in case you're not familiar with overriding and stuff like that. So here I still have access to get default because on the default authorization policy provider, I have access to all these functions. They're all public, okay? So, but with the last one, because it's virtual, I have the option to override it. So if I call the previous two functions, they're going to go to the default implementation, but because I've overridden this here, it's going to go to this implementation. And if I wouldn't have overridden it, okay, if I would have wanted to do something with the options and then grab the base and pass it to there, right, or do something with the base. But I actually do want to override it, and what I will do is I will essentially say, right, I want to add some functionality to it, but I still want to maintain the functionality that the default authorization policy provider gives me. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to still implement the way the default authorization policy provider resolves policies usually. So if I register any policies in my authorization filter, I still want them to be resolved as they were. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on base, which is going to be this base class, and I'm going to get the get policy async function. Okay, and I'm just going to pass the policy name down to it, and I'm going to return this task. Okay, so at this point, this function is essentially doing the same thing that the default authorization policy provider function did here. All right, so not to get off track, what we're doing is we're trying to dynamically create an authorization policy based on the parameter that this policy name is going to represent. Okay, so because we cannot sort of register a function, we cannot pass any parameters here, we need to be able to pass parameters into this function here, since this is what the middleware is using. Okay, so hopefully as we go through this example, it's going to make a little bit more sense. So first thing, when we're going to define the policy name, and what policy name is, if you're confused, like what is this parameter, right? When we go into the home controller and when we set the policy here, this is the policy name, okay? So we are going to basically define a, let's say, a notation for a policy name, right? So you can do this really however you want. So I will go for type and value. Okay, so type, I will explain this in a minute, but let's go ahead and create a public class, and this is going to be static class, and it's going to be a kind of a similar example to this operations controller if I had, yeah, this cookie jar options. So I'm essentially just creating a list of static values that I can reuse. All right, and this is going to be the types of policies, right? So, and since these policies are going to be dynamically created, right, I want to name it something accordingly. So let's say dynamic policies, okay, and I will start off with 2. And this will be a const string, and let's name it something like security level, okay, and I am literally going to give it the same name as property name, and I will say rank. Okay, and we're going to go through 2 main examples. One is going to be a little bit simpler than the other one, but let's go ahead. So this is the type part, okay, and the way we would use it is we would say, right, in the home controller, let's say if you want to authorize this, you would have to be security level .5, right? You'd have to have a 5th security level to basically to access this. Okay, so that's essentially what we're trying to achieve. We want to be able to define an authorization header without specifying all the implementations here. Okay, because if the mechanism is reusable, we don't want to reuse this mechanism here and just register stuff based on the name. So enough rambling on. All we want to do here now is essentially try to get a list of these instead of implementing many if statements. I'm just going to create a public enumerable of string, and this is going to be again a static, so it can be a const because it has to be resolved at compile time. So this will have to yield return and security level, and then it will have to return rank. Okay, or can this be const? I don't think it can be const. No, it can be. Okay, so yeah, so let's go ahead and iterate through all of our dynamic policies, and if one of them matches, before we go ahead and try to do what we did previously, however it worked previously, we want to sort of put our way of resolving a authorization policy. Okay, so let's go ahead and say, for each var dynamic policy or custom policy in dynamic policies. Let's get all of them. All right, so now we're going to be iterating through the list of these, and we can basically say, right, if the policy name starts with the custom policy, right, so this is going to be following the notation. So if one of these types meet here, we're essentially going to say, right, we're matching a policy, and this is where we would want to return a policy, right? So policy, and let's go ahead and define it here. So var policy equals new authorization policy builder, right? So hopefully this looks a little bit familiar from how we've built authorization policies in our startup here. And because this is a task, we're going to return from result. Okay, so this doesn't make much sense at the moment because we're not constructing anything cool just yet. But what I will say is, now what we want to do is, because we may have different custom policies, and this is very extreme example. You might never run into this, but if you do, if you will encounter an example where you need like extremely customizable authorization, this will be a really good example. This is where the factory pattern is really good. Based on this type, we essentially want to either provide a requirement or flat out just build the authorization policy and return it here. So I'm going to opt in for building the authorization policy because I think returning a requirement locks you in that all of your policies are going to be quite complex, that you will need to provide handlers for each of them if you're going to be creating new requirements. But what that means, because we'll go into a simple and a complex example, you will understand what that means in a minute. So let's create a public static class again, and this will be a dynamic policy, dynamic authorization policy factory. And this is just going to have one function, which is going to be an authorization policy, right? So we're going to be using the builder in here, and it's going to be a public static authorization policy create. And what we're going to do is we're just going to pass the policy name into here. We're going to split it in two because we have this notation, so it's important to decide on a notation that you're going to use, right? So let's go ahead, bring up our switch statement, and before we do put in a switch statement, let's go ahead and get our parts from the policy name. We're just going to go ahead and split, and again, however you define it, you might have a dash, you might have a pipe. We're going to get the type, and parts, you can either do something like this, so you can access it through an array, or you can just go ahead and select first using link. Okay, and last here, and again, this is up to you. So we have type and value. Now we're gonna go ahead past the type here, and let's return a default. So okay, so essentially let's just return the default here, and then it will work through each type. Let's not forget the return null here. Now first, let's take a look at rank, because I think that's a bit of a simpler example. I'm gonna go ahead and not default. I'm gonna select case, and I'm gonna select dynamic policies, and I'm gonna grab rank. And because let's say you need to be this rank, so like general, admiral, I don't know, you need to be this rank. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, right, you either have this policy or you don't, and let's go ahead and grab this authorization builder, and we're gonna return new authorization builder. We're gonna require claim or role, whatever floats your boat, and we're gonna say rank and whatever value we provide, right? And then we're gonna build this, and voila. All right. Now let's kick it up a notch. Let's create our dynamic authorization dynamic policies, and we're gonna grab the security level. Right. So with the security level, let's say we want you to be either this security level or higher, right? So, or we want it to be specific or something like that. So let's say return new policy, right? So, and since this is going to be a complexier example, what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a public class, and we're gonna say security level requirement. So we're creating again IAuthorizationRequirement. We're creating our customer requirement, and it doesn't matter what we do here. We might actually no, wait, it does matter. So we want to create a public int level. This is I thought this was a policy, and let's implement a getter here because we want to be able to get the level from here, and then we're going to pass the level here, and we're just going to set the level in our constructor level like this, if I start spelling correctly. Okay, and then we're going to add requirements and new security level requirement, and we're just going to go ahead and convert to int32, and we're going to grab the value. All right. So you can see how basically based on the policy that we're going to be providing, how it's going to construct and resolve this policy and try to return it here in just a second. But this is the reason I wanted an authorization policy returned here, because if I would have asked for an IAuthorizationRequirement requirement from here, that means that essentially all of these would need to be requirements, and all of these would need to be complex. All right, and complex in this sense that they will need their own requirements classes and their own handlers. So we will need a handler for this. So let's create a public class security level requirement or security level handler, and authorization handler of this class. Yep. Okay, implement this function, and let's go ahead and return a task. So context, what we want to do, well, essentially we want to say call succeed on this requirement, but what we really need to do is check the level. So let's say var claim value equals context. Let's grab the user. Let's grab claims. I'm hoping it's becoming pretty apparent what we're doing here. First or default, and we're gonna say type equals, where is my static class? Dynamic policies. Dot security level, right? And we're gonna grab the value. So that was a little bit long-winded, but let's go ahead and put this here. All right, so we got the claim value. Now what we want to say is, right, if requirement, and this is going to be a string, so what I will want to do is actually convert to int32 so we are able to compare. And this might crash, so I'm not going to implement a bunch of checks if the user has claim at all, or I mean, I guess I might as well. So if we have this, if we don't say we're 0 or -1, or let's say 0. Okay, something like that, right? So we might have a value, we might not have a value, right? And then say requirement level. So this level has to be bigger or equals to, let's say cal. That's why I can't spell it. Claim value. All right, say claim value. And if it is, we're going to succeed this call. Otherwise, we're going to say task, complete task. Okay, and we complete the task here. So essentially what this handler will do is, based on the level that we have defined on our controller, it's going to check the user's claim value, and it's going to compare the two, and it's going to determine, right, do you actually have access to this, right? And the beautiful thing about it is that we can define any level that we want on the policy, okay, as long as that claim is set, so you can adapt your code any way you want. Okay, so we have this. Let's go ahead and hook it up. So we have this dynamic authorization policy factory. Let's go ahead and just say, instead of passing this policy here, I mean, we can assign it here. Let's actually do that. I think that will be a little bit cleaner. We're going to create a, and we're going to pass policy name here, and just like that. So let's go ahead and try this example out. I am going to need to first register this. So let's clean this up a little bit. This is our type. Okay, so there can only be one. Not one, but there can be multiple. But essentially, we will need to override this. So let's grab this custom authorization policy provider. Let's go into startup, and after here, services, add singleton, and let's pass this custom authorization policy provider, and I will paste it again just so I can delete this first part and pass the IAuthorizationPolicyProvider. Provider. Let's get this class, and let's call this. Okay, so we have our policy provider, and this is what's going to override this. Now, in this class, I have put a bunch of things here. Remember that you can inject stuff into here and you can do complex stuff. I want to grab this security handler as well. So I'm going to go ahead and say services, add scoped, and IAuthorizationHandler, and pass my security level handler. Okay, there it is. And now, security level requirement, I don't need to do anything with that. So that's all A-OK. Now what we can do is, let's say this here, secret, and we'll just say level. Now essentially what we want to do is modify this authorize attribute, or rather extend it to accept our security level requirements. Alright, so let's go ahead and create a public class, and let's say security level attribute, and I don't think we need to name it attribute, but let's do it anyway, and authorize attribute. Okay, and what authorize attribute has is the policy name which we want to set. So let's create a constructor, and in here we're going to pass in a level, and in the constructor we're going to set the policy to be dynamic policies, and we're going to grab the security level, and then let's actually use string interpolation, or rather string formatting, and create our notation. All right, and I guess you can put this notation inside of this dynamic policies class, but I'll just leave it here. So we're setting the policies here. Let's go ahead, grab this security level attribute, and let's put it here, and I'll remove the attribute part, and I'm gonna grab this, so security level, and let's pass 5. Okay, and then we're gonna do something like secret higher level, and let's get 10 here. So good test would be, let's grab this one, and claim type, let's say dynamic policies. Oh my god, can't spell, can I? And let's give it 7, lucky 7, and actually string like this. Okay, Okay, so we got string policy. Yep, all good. So now if we authenticate, we should be able to reach secret level, but we should not be able to reach secret higher level. Let's go ahead and give it a try. Okay, so home/secret. Nice. Let's go to home secret level and access is denied. I wonder why. Did I mess up my if statement as I usually do? Let's put a breakpoint here and let's see what happens. Home/secret page. Okay, level. Claim value is 7. And as I did, alright, so I am a bit of a noob in program. I don't know how to use computers, okay? So let's fire this up again. Okay, let's refresh this. So I am authenticated. Nice. Let's go ahead and go home secret so I can reach the secret page. Secret level. Okay, we're still there. And if we go to higher level, there we go. We're not authenticated anymore. So hopefully you can see the power of this implementation if you have to sort of provide dynamic functionality, setting up the way these policies are constructed once instead of specifying like 1,000 of them. So imagine if you had like 20 security levels and you had to do something like this. You know, you'd want to quit before you started, you know. But this will be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. It was quite a lengthy one. Again, I want to remind you, if you're still watching this video, that these things are not necessary, but it's good to know that they're available to you. And when you encounter a situation where you could use these tools, you're going to remember about them and you're going to know that this stuff exists in .NET Core and that you can override this. Remember that .NET Core is very extensible and customizable. But for now, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, especially if it's around the topic I haven't covered in the videos that relates to authentication and authorization. And as always, see you in my other episodes.